Okay, we are going. So again, this is the second of the three Excel trainings that I am providing. This one is going to be all about pivot tables. So pivot tables are a very useful piece of it's a very useful tool to know how to use in Excel. I do a lot of my data analysis through with Utopia data using pivot tables. So I'm going to hopefully try to show exactly how to use them and the power that they are behind there. For those that are joining, who've just recently joined, there is a tiny URL on the screen right now. You are able to go to that URL. The URL is also in the chat I just put. Click on that. It'll take you to a Google Drive. Right click on the one that's on the file that says Excel with data and download that, and then go ahead and open it up. We will use this file throughout today. So pivot tables. Pivot tables, I said earlier, are a super powerful feature inside of Excel. There is a gentleman by the name of Bill Jellens. He is known throughout a lot of the Microsoft community as Mr. Excel. He has done a lot with Excel. He's done a lot of the coding, a lot of the features within Excel. He has stated that no other tool in Excel gives you the flexibility and analytical power of a pivot table. As I said earlier, I use pivot tables quite frequently when I'm analyzing Utopia data. I find that I can get information very quickly out of a lot of information. Again, I look at the state data, so I'm looking at 15, 20,000 student records throughout the system. That's just what we report up to NRS. We've probably got another 7 to 10,000 students that we don't actually report on a yearly basis. Marcy stated fun. I do find it fun. I do like analyzing the data and getting into it. And pivot tables are my cup of tea to go to. So when I get a data download from the Excel and put it into Excel, pivot tables are usually what I go for. And I want to show you guys exactly kind of how pivot tables work, the type of information that you can get out of it, and we'll go from there. There are a couple rules that we need to do that you need to understand about pivot tables. Pivot tables, when you have the data from any source, we're going to be using Utopia data today, but any data that you have must have data organized into columns with headings. All reports that can be pulled from Utopia have already been set up this way. Everything's organized into columns of data, and every report has a header row. It's usually bolded, but that's the information that is in that row. Student ID, first name, last name, that type of stuff. You also can't have any empty columns or rows. Again, this is similar to our sorting and filtering feature that we dealt with last week. You can have blank information within the column, but you can't have an entire column or an entire row that is blank. It will screw up the data or the data grab that the pivot table is doing, because the pivot table essentially captures a snapshot of what the data currently looks like, and it will go to the furthest most empty rows and columns. So if you have an empty column or row in there, you need to make sure and get rid of it. And that first empty cell or empty column or row needs to be the end of your data. And the last thing is you need to have all the information in the column needs to be consistent, meaning that dates need to be in date fields. Numbers need to be in number fields. Text needs to be in text field. If you try mixing, say, a date and a name within the same cell, it's really going to throw pivot tables off. So all reports that pull from Utopia already have this consistency within it. So I just want to make sure that as you move forward and do any of your own data for any LEA or even any of your own stuff, that you make sure that the data is consistent. Okay, so at this time, make sure you have that sheet that we're working with today open and ready to go. And I want you to go to the Pivot Table Data Worksheet Down at the bottom, it should be the one that is by default open. Again, let me know if you can't get to that. I have had a number of people say that they can get to the Google Drive that that you downloaded that data from, but if you can't, let me know. And let's go ahead and we are going to immediately, if you look at this data, I hope that you kind of recognize the layout of the data. The data that we're working on, at least this is the format of what the NRS registration report will be. Again, it's our sink full of information report. There's a lot of information that is held on this spread or on this report. Again, none of this data is actually real. None of the names, IDs, anything like that is actually real data within inside of it. But a lot of the outcomes are associated or are based upon real information. But I want you guys to be able to recognize this report and be able to then go back to your own NRS registration after we are done with this. And I want you to be able to run your own pivot tables and pull your own information from your own. And so I'm hoping that this will make a little bit more sense as we continue to go on. But again, this is the NRS registration report setup is what we're going to be working on. So to insert a pivot table, if you are working in Excel, it's pretty easy. Up at the very top on the ribbon, there is an insert there's an insert tab right next to home. Go ahead and click on that, and on the far left-hand side, there is a word called pivot tables. Just click on that, and it will come up with this window that pops up. Now, there's a few things on here that it will ask you for. For one, it asks you for the range of your data. Now, you'll see that by default, it's going to pull A1 through CC500. Basically, what that's saying is it's going to pull any information. So from column A to column CC, and then from row 1 to row 500, it's going to pull data. And the reason it's automatically pulling that data is because that's where it reaches its first blank cell, blank column, and blank row. And so that's what we want to do it as. You can do external data sources. I really haven't done a whole lot of them, but you can do external data sources with pivot tables as well. The next important piece is where do you want to put this pivot table? By default, it's always going to put it onto a new worksheet. It's going to create its own little worksheet, call it probably worksheet 1, worksheet 2, depending on what you're working with. And so that'll be if you create it into a new worksheet. There are times in which I actually place it into the existing worksheet. So on the same worksheet that I'm working on, if I only have, say, 5 or 6 rows or 5 or 6 columns that I'm working with, but say hundreds of rows, I will put it onto the same worksheet just so that I have the data and the pivot table all on the same worksheet. With what we're doing, go ahead and make sure it's selected on the new worksheet. We're going to create a brand new worksheet, and it's going to create this. And then go ahead and hit OK. For Sheets, do I have anybody that is working in Sheets today? I had a couple last time. I just want to know if there's anybody working in Sheets and that I need to actually step through the process there. Okay. Doesn't sound like anybody is in Sheets today, which is fine. If you're watching this on the recording afterwards, you will see that the information is there. It's always in the blue on how to access it. Again, you click data, go to pivot table, and then follow the order to get all the information there. So when you get it, it should look like something similar to this. I know it's a bit small, but I'm kind of showing the entire sheet. With Excel, you are going to have a place that has like a little graphic that says Pivot Table 1. And you'll have pivot table fields off on the right-hand side. If you look through those pivot table fields on the side, you will see the column names, student ID, program ID, NRS registration, so on and so forth. And being that we go through, well, about 50 plus columns, you will see that as you scroll through that, every column is listed. This is why it's super important to have headers. as each one of it, because that header row is what's pulled for all of these names. In Sheets, it looks very similar. You have a sheet. It doesn't have the graphic. It's a little bit differently, but all of your information is off on the sides. In Sheets, you don't actually have the list of all rows. You just kind of have to start building it, and then you'll end up getting the list later. So that's a little bit of difference between the two. PivotTable designs. The nice thing about pivot tables is there's no one way to do this. PivotTable designs are your own. If you want to, it's kind of based upon the information that you are looking at. So with this data, with the NRS registration report, there is a lot of information that is pulled from there. And so what I may be pulling at a state level could be different from what Davis or Granite is pulling based upon what they want to look at. And so the nice thing is even if we're looking at the same data, say we're looking at Social Security number information about who does and doesn't have it, we can both of us could build it in two different ways, but yet get the same type of information out of it. And so designing the pivot table is very unique to each individual self. When we go through here, I am going to specify where to put certain ones so that we are all looking at the same information. But when you design yours after this meeting, it's very much on your own. You get to decide exactly what you want, how you want it, and don't be afraid to play around with it. So if the pivot table doesn't give you the information you want immediately, try something else, reorder everything, and you'll kind of see how order matters inside of pivot tables. With Excel, you can do one of two things to put information into your columns, your rows, your values. If you just simply click on the checkbox next to each one of them, it will automatically put everything into rows. By default, Excel will assume that you want all of your information into rows. So doing the checkbox will put everything into rows, but if you want things into columns, you have to drag things into columns. And it's really easy. You just take the column that you want, say gender, for example, if you want to base everything on a male, female, gender base, because that's how Utopia collects it. Simply drag gender into columns, and you'll see that the male female options will show up on top rather than in a row on the side. But we will talk about each one of these a little bit more in depth, what filters are, how to use them, the columns, the rows, and the values. The values are what we're actually searching for, so they're the number of students or the total contact hours, that type of information. That's what values will be. But again, the design of the pivot tables is all unique to each individual one of us. And so we have currently in the meeting, we've got 19 of us in here, and every one of us can design a pivot table based upon what we feel, what we want. So the design is very unique. So let's go ahead and build our first pivot table. It's going to be something super basic, super simple, nothing too hard. And so what I want us to do is I want to go and find the field called starting fiscal EFL level. It's down a little bit ways. It's next to is IELCE placement test, NRS registration date. But go ahead and find that, and you want that in the row. So you can either click the checkbox and it will automatically fill it in, or you can just highlight over it and you'll end up getting this little four-way arrow, and then just drag it into rows. When you do that, you should see all of the functioning levels 1 through 6 for both ABE and ESL. So it should create 12 new rows for each one of them. And it does this because what the pivot table did is it went through and found every unique label or every unique value within that column, and it put it into here. So that's how it came up with those values. Next, what we want to do is we want to see everything based upon registration type. As you know, there are multiple registration types within Utopia. The majority of the students, or in fact all students, get an NRS registration, but then you have a couple other registrations that you can add. Now, if you don't have a dual enrollment or you don't use IET within your programs, the registration type might not be available for, or it'll always be available, but it may not be prevalent for the information that you are trying to pull. In this situation, the program that we have has a mix of some IETs as well as some NRS registrations. So we want to see how many of each that we have in it of each individual row. So find the registration type, which is about 5 columns above or five rows above that pivot table. And since we want this in the columns, you must drag it and put it into the columns. So if you do it, you should have all of your functioning levels off on the right-hand side, ABE's level 1 through 6 and ESL's 1 through 6. And then you should have on the top should be IET and NRS registration. Then the last thing we want to do is let's go ahead and pull the number of hours. We want to see how many hours each functioning level has based upon what their registration type is. Now the total NRS registration is down towards the bottom. It is probably about 10 rows up from the bottom. It says total NRS hours in fiscal program. If you go ahead and click on the checkbox, it will automatically put it into values. And the reason it does that is Excel recognizes that these are numbers. It doesn't assume that you want to do these in rows because otherwise you would have a row for 1, 1.25, 1.50, depending on the values that are there. Sometimes that's useful, and you can probably play with it and figure out how or why it's useful. Where do you drag registration type to? Drag the registration type into column. It's kitty corner from rows, and so drag registration type into columns. I'm stuck dragging my registration type, did not go into the column. Okay, here is, let me get rid of you and get rid of you. Okay, so, and starting. Okay, so the first one we wanted to do was the functioning level. So we're going to go find the functioning level. The starting functioning level is right here, and you can either click on the checkbox here, or you can actually drag it. You see how it kind of creates the four-way arrow. You simply drag it into rows and let it go, and you'll see that all the functioning levels will go into there. Clicking the checkbox is a lot easier. It does it a lot faster. But again, as I stated before, that clicking the checkbox will always throw everything into rows. It won't go put stuff into columns. So if we want the registration type, which is just about 5 above, go to make sure that little arrow plus is there and then drag it into columns. You'll see that there is a green line stating that that's where it's going to be dropped, and you simply drop it in there and it'll say IET and NRS registration. Then the last thing we want to do is we want to see all of the hours within the fiscal year. That's down at the bottom. If you go down to the bottom, it's about 10 up from the bottom. It says total NRS hours in fiscal year. And if you click the checkbox, you'll see that by default, it puts it into values, which is great. It's fine. Excel recognizes that this is numbers and doesn't assume that you want to put it into rows, because otherwise you'd have a row underneath each one of them. This is actually what it looks like if you actually did put it into rows. Not saying that you couldn't do it, but that's just that by default, because it is a number, Excel will recognize that when you click it and you want to do some analysis with that you are going to want to see values. And so this is what you should end up having it look like. Let me blow that up a little bit bigger. So you can see that all of your rows are ABE levels 1 through 6 for both ABE and ESL. And you can see that the grand total of all of the hours. And so in our data set that we have, you can see that there are 253.75 hours of ABE level 5 student, or ABE level 3 students, excuse me. And so you can kind of see a grand total of how many hours. So currently, with the total number of students that we have in here, you can see that we have 54,320 hours, and of those, 2,500 hours are IET. Is this information that you would probably pull for your program? I don't know. If you want to see kind of how many hours that your program is doing with IET versus NRS. Are we all working on the same data set? Should we get the same totals? Luann, yes, you should all be getting the same totals currently. I don't believe we should be getting anything else. So that's how that's just a very basic. My level 2 is different. I hope I didn't give you guys. Is your guys' grand total very similar? Grand total is 54,300. Close. Okay. And it could be the data that I was messing with. I could have messed with it a little bit as I was doing some of the reconfiguration of it. I built this data set in 2 different days, and so, all right. It sounds like everybody, at least probably everybody, yeah, a rounding issue. Probably everybody who of course, everybody that downloaded it has the same data set, and so I believe mine is an older data set, and I forgot to refresh it. And I apologize for that. I should have made sure that I downloaded this and had the same information. But yeah, so besides the data, and this is what's going to happen in real life as well. Every program is going to be a little bit different, and so luckily, this case it's not going to matter. This is all mock data, and of course, I didn't do it right. My bad. But this is how to build something very basic. All we wanted to know is essentially how many hours each registration had per area. And if you ran your own NRS registration right now, you could pull this exact same information with yours. Are there any questions about just kind of building something generic? We're going to get into a little bit more in depth and building some harder ones later, but just kind of building the initial pivot table, dragging the column or dragging the fields into the rows, that kind of information. Is there any questions that anybody has right now? Luann asks, what would you call this pivot table? To give it a name, I would probably name this something like the number of total hours each NRS registration has by their entering functioning level. And that's the thing with pivot tables is once you start putting pieces of information, your columns, your rows, and especially your values, you're going to string out what the pivot table name is because you try to include. I can't say that this is. I mean, I could call this total contact hours by functioning level, but that doesn't include my NRS registration type. And so once you start building columns and rows and values within it, the names of your pivot tables start to become very large when you try to explain it to people. And usually the way I build my pivot tables is we've had a conversation, either me with you guys as programs or me with the state team, and we look at this and we've come up with a question. And the question in this case may have been, well, if we have an IET program, how many hours is the IET program contributing or based upon the grand total of all hours within the program? And this is how I would probably end up building it and getting the information. And so when I present this data, whether to the state team or whether to you as the programs, I may not actually talk at all about this NRS registration row because everybody has an NRS registration, and that's not the information we're really looking for. What we are looking for is this information. We want to know essentially what is the percentage of total hours of IET students versus total hours grand total wise. And so I may not actually share this data when I'm presenting it, but this is the type of information that I would pull. And so if you're looking at something specific, then I would label it that. If in that case, I would say that this is the percentage of IET hours versus grand total. And that's probably where I'd cut it. But when we talk about the whole data set, as Luann asked it, what would I call this whole pivot table? As I stated before, it would probably be I'm trying to remember what I called it, the total number of hours for each functioning level based upon their registration type. So, okay. Let's go ahead and continue. Let me drag this off the screen for a minute. Okay, updating pivot tables. I do this periodically, but it's an important piece to know how to do. Usually what will happen is you'll get a piece of information or you'll get a data set that you want, and you've ran a pivot table on it. Now, if you want to update the data because you have new data that's going in it, or additional data that's going in it, say you're going to take two different types of reports and merge them together type of an idea, but they all are based upon the same, we want to know how to update the data. So what I want you to do is go back to the Pivot Table Data tab down at the bottom. It should probably be the second one because your sheet one would have taken that first spot. Now, if you go ahead and go down to line 502, you will see that there are about 8 or 9 blank spaces. And I apologize, it's not 502, it's... Actually, that might be why my information is off, is I think my information. So you should see a blank line from line 502 to 509. Am I correct? Perfect. Milan says yes. So when we built the first pivot table and it automatically pulled the data, it went and found the first blank row. Now that first blank row was down to line 502. So it pulled lines 501 and up and went all the way over to column CC. So now what we want to do is we want to update it. We have a new data set, or an updated data set, or additional data that we want to put in this and we want to analyze. So go ahead and take lines 502 through 509 and go ahead and delete those. So highlight them, highlight all of them, right click and go to delete rows. Now what we've done is we've now created a massive data set of approximately, it should be 1,000 students. But we want to now update our pivot table. Now we could go through the same process of just going to insert a new pivot table and create a brand new pivot table. But if the pivot table we took a while building, we got it exactly where we wanted to, we don't want to delete our current pivot table. We just want to update it. And that's what we're going to do here. So go back now to sheet 1. And that should be where your pivot table is. And make sure you have anywhere within the pivot table selected. Once you do, up at the very top, you should see something. You should see a new tab open up. It'll say either Pivot Table Analyze or it'll just say Analyze. Go ahead and click on that. There is a section titled Data, and one of those icons in there is Change Data Source. Go ahead and click on that. Now, when you click on that, it will open up what looks to be part of when we were creating the pivot table. It's asking us now, we want to create a brand new, yes, I will show you the screen. Okay, so we are inside of the pivot table. I'm back on 1. I've already deleted the rows. So back onto here, I have this Pivot Table Analyze. They've recently changed it to Pivot Table Analyze. Some of the older versions of Excel will simply just say Analyze. But go ahead and click on that, and you will get a new set of information in this ribbon. There is a data section right here. One's called Refresh, one's called Change Data Source. Now what we want to do is we want to change the data source because we need to add additional columns or additional rows in this case to our data set. So it comes up with this new data source. What data source are you wanting to look at? Now go ahead and you would want to select everything from the new. And so if you don't know the hotkeys to jump from cells to cells, it is you hold Control Shift and then you use your arrow keys. So currently I'm in A1, and if I hit Control Shift right and down, I will select all of my new data set, which should be which in yours it would look the exact same. It should say A1 through CC 1001. Once you have that, you go ahead and hit OK. Now, does anybody see, besides the fact that our grand total has changed and some of the other hours have changed, is there something else that you've noticed that has changed on this pivot table that we have built? I couldn't switch my data range. Marcy, there is another option that you can do is just simply click anywhere. I usually do it up in this upper corner and hit Control A. Matching totals now. Perfect. And then it should give you A1 through CC101. Robert, as I'm on Pivot Table Analyze, what should I do next? When you're on Pivot Table Analyze, click this button that says Change Data Source. The Change Data Source will come up with a brand new window that looks like Change Data Source. Click up into A1, go ahead and hit and select Control A, and that should do the same thing as Control Shift and using your arrows. So you should your new data set should be A1 through CC1001. And when you have that, go ahead and hit OK. Now, Luann said that our totals now match. It seems like I had moved one of mine down, which is good to know that my data set's not totally off. But is there anything else that you've noticed specifically about the number of rows that we have off on the side? Okay, yep, a blank one. Good job, Elisa. Alyssa. I hope I pronounced one of those two right. Yep, you will notice. Elisa. Okay, perfect. If you'll notice that, yes, as she stated, that there is now a blank row. And the reason there's a blank row is some of the students that we have in here aren't yet tested. They do not have an EFL set for them, whether it's a preliminary or a provisional EFL, or whether they just haven't been tested. But we have some students that haven't been tested. And so what Excel did is it recognized that, hey, we now have a 13th unique item for this row. And so that's why we would want to, that's kind of why I want to update it rather than just create a brand new one. Is we put all this time building it, and it updated the information based upon what we had here. So that's how you update information. Now, a lot of the times we won't have a strong need to just update the data. Sometimes we will. Other times people will just build brand new pivot tables and they'll just create new sheet after sheet. Either way works, but I wanted to show you that you can take your original data set that you already have and go ahead and add additional data just by creating or changing your data source. Okay. Any questions so far about updating data, creating just a basic pivot table? Okay. All right, let's see how much of this we can get through in about the next 20 minutes or so. All right, as we build pivot tables, there comes times, and I hit this, to where you just kind of want to start over. Just give me a scratch brand new pivot table. Now you could delete the sheet that you currently have and just create a brand new pivot table, or there's a little bit easier way to do it. In Excel, and I forgot to color code these, I apologize. In Excel, up on the Analyze where we went ahead and updated, right next to data, that section data, there's a new section called actions. Now that top action you'll see is called clear. It has a little drop down arrow next to it. And then the top option will be clear all. When you do that, you will see that it will clear your entire pivot table and just give you something brand new and fresh. I find that I use this when I start to get too much information, or my pivot table is really kind of messy and I want to start over, or I started to think, oh, maybe this isn't maybe this isn't the information that I want to pull or how I want to pull it. I want to do it a different way. I'll just go ahead and clear it. Now you could take and go through your pivot table fields and uncheck each box and it will drag it back up. You could essentially drag them from their field below, from the column rows values, and drag them up. So there are multiple ways you can clear a pivot table, but this clear all will erase the entire pivot table in one shot. On Sheets, it's a little bit differently. There is no clear all. On Sheets, there are little X's next to each one of the columns, the rows, the values that you put. You simply hit X next to each one of them, and that's the way to clear it. All right, pivot table counting values. Let's go ahead and start building this, and it'll make a little bit more sense why I'm going to show why it's crucial to know how to do this. On your rows, go ahead and click the latest pop MSG. It's towards the top. And student ID. Okay, so let me drag this back over here. So we want latest pop MSG. It's right here. It's a couple underneath where the starting fiscal EFL was. So click the checkbox or drag it down to rows, and you'll see that we've got a blank, an EFL, and an HSE. Now, if we wanted to see how many of each one of these we have on the NRS registration, let's go ahead and we want to pull essentially what's called a count by student ID. We want a unique count of each student. So go ahead and click the checkbox next to student ID. Now, those numbers are massively large, and there's no way that this current program, knowing that there's only about 1,000 or that there is 1,000 students on that data sheet, there's no way that 24 million of them got an EFL, or that 88 million of them got an HSE. What by default Excel likes to sum everything. It doesn't by default count, so it will sum all numbers. And since student ID field is a number field, it will sum it. But we want to change this to where it's a unique count, where it's counting each individual one. And it's pretty easy to do. I do this quite frequently whenever I'm analyzing the adult ed data. Down here in the value section, you'll see that it says sum of student ID. Now we want to change this to a count. So hit the little drop down box, and you'll get a new field that opens up here, and you'll want value field settings. When you do that, a new window will pop up. In here, you can do a couple things. If you wanted to give it a custom name, you could. Otherwise, it's just going to pull based upon the information that we're actually looking at. But what's important is how we want to, in this case, summarize the value fields. How do we want to change this, or how do we want to summarize this field? And you'll see that the second one down is count. We want to count each unique row. We want to see that count rather than just total everything up. Total is great when we're looking, or summing it all up is great when we're looking at hours, or we're looking at ones and zeros, or a quantity count. That's great to look at it based upon sum. But when we're looking at student ID field, and we want to count these. So go ahead and click on count and hit OK. And you'll see that the title of that column changed. It now says count of student ID. And so you can see that in our data set that we have 662 who do not have any sort of MSG. Of the 1,000 students, we have 252 that have an EFL and 86 that have an HSE. But it's really important to know how to change the values from sums to counts, because if you deal with your student IDs and that's the field that you want to count on, which I find that I do quite frequently when I analyze this data, I always need to change it to count, because by default Excel likes to sum everything up. Inside of Sheets, it's very similar. Once you put the value in there, you'll end up with a box that looks like this. This should be on the right-hand side of the screen. You'll go to this Summarize By section and hit drop down, and you'll see a list of actually what looks like functions, Excel functions, which is what they are. And the second option down, second or third option down is count. You would click that and you'll end up with the same type of information. All right, pivot table filtering. Filtering within pivot tables, currently up to this point, we've essentially looked at every row as an individual. We've only looked at it as a grand total, as the entire sheet. But there are times that we want to really narrow in. We want to focus on a specific group, a specific functioning level, a specific age group, a specific ethnicity, gender, something. You want to essentially target down on a specific group. And with pivot tables, you can do that. We just need to add a filtering option. So for our demo, we're going to look at SSNs. This isn't the way that I pulled a lot of the SSN information for December's meeting, but this will do very similar. And then you can take this type of information and move it into table 4 and 6, which is where I pulled a lot of that information. So go ahead and clear your pivot tables. Again, go to Analyze, go to the Action section, go to Clear, and hit Clear All. So we're going to start with a brand new field. So we want in our row, we want the has SSN. So if you can find the has SSN, it's just below the email address. We want the has SSN, and we want to put that in the row. Then we want to go ahead and we want to see the values of student ID, but we want to make sure it's the count. So click on student ID and it'll put it into the values. And then go to the value settings and change it to count. Now, if you got those two so far, this is what it should look like. You should have simply yes and no's, and you should have 384, 616 with a grand total of 1,000. Okay. Now is where we start to get into the filtering. So what we want to do is let's look at functioning level. Let's see how many yeses and nos we have based on functioning level. So find that starting fiscal EFL level. It's down just a little bit of ways. We used it at the beginning. And instead of clicking on the checkbox, make sure you drag it into filters. Now, when you drag it into filters, you will see that at the tops in A1 and B1, you will see it now says starting filters with an all in parentheses and a drop-down arrow. Now, what we want to do, and let me drag this over so you can follow along. We want to look at how many, let's say, ABE level 4s are in here. How many of our ABE level 4 targeted students have a yes or no? And it's really easy to do that. I mean, we could go ahead and drag this fiscal functioning level into the rows and compare yes, no's, or compare it within the columns, and we have this massive column, but we're going to simplify this. Let's only look at ABE level 4s. And that's the only information I want to see. I don't care right now about any of the other functioning levels at the current moment. So click the drop-down box and you'll see that there's a list of functioning levels that shows up. We have the blank one at top for those students that haven't been tested, and then we have every level. Go ahead and click on the ABE level 4 and it will highlight it in blue. And then go ahead and hit OK. So what this did is the pivot table or Excel said, okay, I want to find every student with an ABE level 4 fiscal, or with an ABE level 4 EFL level. Then I'm going to go ahead and then filter them down even further, or analyze them even further onto the yes, no based on social security numbers. So we can see that we have a grand total of 199 students that are ABE level 4. Of those 199, 45 of them have yet to give a social security number. Now, from this point, you can go and start analyzing In fact, if you wanted to, you could even double click on that 45. Again, all I did was double click on that 45 and it opens up a brand new sheet. Now, what this does is Excel looks and says, okay, you want to see those 45? Great, here they are. So this list of students, so Elizabeth, Joserina, Robert, Hannah, Dylan, this would be the list of ABE level 4s that do not have a social security number. And you can verify that by scrolling over. Here's our starting fiscal EFL. And here's, you see all the way down, there's only ABE level 4s. Now, if we go over to the social security number tab, which was a little bit over this way, column O, you'll see has SSN, all these are no. So this would be a quick way to get that list. So rather than trying to come over here into the pivot table or into your data set and using a couple filters, I mean, you could use filters to get the same information, but I find that this would probably be a lot easier and a lot faster to kind of find some of the information that you are looking for. And again, to find that analytical data of who these 45 are, simply double click. And you can do that with any pivot table that you've created. If you just simply double click on the value that you want to look at, and it will analyze and it will produce that list of 45. It will take them and put them into a brand new sheet that you can then analyze based upon them alone. Okay. Questions on pivot table filtering? I'm hoping silence is good, that you guys are fully understanding this. Otherwise, everybody is completely lost and I just don't know. Okay. We'll continue to move on. Luann, good so far. Sweet. All right. This talks all about that drill down data, what I kind of talked about earlier. I didn't update this and I apologize. This is from an older training that I did that's not Utopia data, but that sheet does the exact same thing. If you want to see who the 45 are, it's drill down data is that's what I call it. It's just a more analytical tool that Excel has that you can utilize. All right, there's some additional features within pivot tables that we'll kind of go through kind of for the last little bit of time. One of them is showing a percent of total. It's really easy. I mean, to calculate some of it within your head. I mean, when we're basing everything on thousands like we are here, it's really kind of easy to see what percent totals are. But most programs don't have an even amount, let alone they don't even probably end in a nice number to actually figure out. So if, in this case, if we wanted to figure out how many 45 was of, call it 342 students, without grabbing a calculator, it's really hard to kind of see the percent of totals. But pivot tables will let you change the data. So rather than looking at, say, counts, for example, you can start to look at percentages. And I'll show you how to do that. So let's go ahead, clear the pivot table you are on, and let's build a new pivot table looking at employment status. So employment status is what we want to put in the row. It is quite a ways down. And I had it this morning. I apologize. As I said, again, this is the NRS registration report. So this is the one downside of having so much information on a report is that a lot of information. Oh, there it is. It's next to highest grade, location of highest grade, long-term unemployment. It's next to all of that information. Okay. Then let's go ahead and let's just do another student ID count. So go up to the top, go to student ID. Again, convert that from sum to count. And then you should have a new count that looks very similar to what is on the screen. All right, let me pull this over so that everybody can follow along. So you can see we have our 1,000 students in the cell. We have one that didn't report having an employment status. That might be something to kind of go in and look, and why didn't they report this? It could have been that they just dropped off before we got that information and they didn't actually do anything, in which case there's nothing we can do. But if that student's still active, then you need to find that information, or it's just it kind of got missed. So we'll kind of see. But what we want to do in this for the pivot table is we want to convert all these counts into percentages. And it's really easy to do. Go ahead and right click on this title of count of student ID. Why is there a 1 in row 4? As I basically what Excel did is it went through and it found all of the titles, and it happened to find one student that didn't have an employment status set. Now, why that student does it, why that employment wasn't set, I don't know. It'd be something that you'd have to go through and look at it. Again, I did pull this from real data, at least the basis of it. And so there is one student. Again, it could be a student who came in, went to register for a program, and then dropped off before you could get the information. And so they have an NRS registration, but they didn't give all the pieces of information. That could be possibly why that there's a 1. But this would be a way in which it's like, if you wanted to catch to see if you had all the data for your students, this would be a great resource on how to do that, simply looking at a count. But we want to go ahead and turn this into a percentage. So on the header for the student ID, go ahead and right click, and then there's an option that says show value as, and it'll have a little arrow. The second option down is a percent of grand total. That's what we want to look at right now. So go ahead and click on that. You'll see that there are other options, and depending on how many builds you have upon each other, because you can stick more than one thing in a row, more than one thing in a column technically, and you can build off of it. So you could see percentage of the parent row, percentage of a column total, that kind of stuff. And the best way to really kind of understand how all of that works is just to kind of go in and play with it. You're welcome to give me a call and say, hey, I'm trying to work out this. Let's work it together, and I'm happy to help. But that's kind of how I learned, is I'm like, well, what does this mean? What happens when I click on this? Honestly, worst case that you can do is erase the pivot table and just restart from the beginning. So we want this percentage of grand total. So go ahead and click on that, and you'll see that everything now turns into a percentage. So of the students that were employed coming in, you have this program has 47% of their students that come in as employed. And then there's 17% that are unemployed. These are the students who are searching for a job. I wouldn't say that you need to, I mean, as going back to what our kind of theme is for this year, I'm getting personal with the students. Talk to these students after, or when you analyze this type of data. Look at who these students are. Who are the ones who came in unemployed, and have a conversation. Hey, have you guys found a job? Follow up on the students, see what it's doing. Make it personal for these students. And this is the type of analytical data that you can pull, that you can ask those types of questions. So, okay. All right. Are there any questions? I do have, if you will look at the bottom, there is a questions tab. I did create a couple of questions. We don't have time for you guys to go through this. We are hitting our hour mark at 3:30. So we got about 2 minutes. But go through this if you would like. If you really want to fully see if you have grasped pivot tables. Most of this information is pretty basic. I don't believe it's really hard to find out. And just kind of play with the pivot table. See what kind of information you can pull. You can play with this data set to your heart's content. It's all fake data, so you can store it, take it with you, and have fun with it. And maybe go into the data itself and change one thing here or there and just see what it does with your pivot tables. Update that data. But there again, there are questions. These 3 questions on the screen right now are the same 3 questions that should be on your pivot table or on your Excel sheet. But go ahead and do that. You're welcome. If you want to double check, make sure that you analyze the data correctly and you pulled the correct information. You're welcome to shoot me an email and say, hey, here are the answers that I have. Is this correct? And I can help walk you through it. If they're not, we can walk through exactly how to do it. But are there any questions before we wrap up? Okay. I will go ahead and stop recording.